Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. If you walk through the quiet side corridors of the Vatican on a gray winter morning, long before the museums open, before the footsteps of tourists turn ancient marble to dust, you might feel something strange, a hum, not of electricity, not of prayer, but of time. It wasn't always a place of silence, okay? Once, under St. Peter's great dome, there ticked a machine, not a machine of faith, but of metal, of brass, of measure. A clock, but not just any clock. This was a mechanism older than memory, older even than Galileo's trial. And for centuries, it sat forgotten, mostly in a tower that few ever climbed, quietly tracing the hours of a church that had once feared the very act of measuring time. This is the story of the Vatican's first mechanical timekeeper, how it ended up being removed in 1939. The story doesn't begin in Rome. It begins, of all places, in England. The year is 1275, and on the cold stone walls of Salisbury Cathedral, the English monk is attempting something radical. He is building a clock. It will have no face, no hands, only a bell, a weight suspended by rope, a gear slowly turning, a hammer lifted, then dropped, tick, tock, chime. It is the beginning of something that will soon change the way the church experiences time. My prayer, not by season, but by minute. Fast forward 100 years, Italy has caught the fever. Cities, from Padua to Florence, are commissioning clocks, public ones, loud ones, meant not just to ring out the hours, but to demonstrate control. Time now is something a city can own, and while monasteries still pray at matins and vespers, something deeper is shifting. The rhythm of bells is becoming the rhythm of governance. The Pope watches. At first, with caution, because while clocks are useful, they are also mechanical. And in the 14th century, that's not always a compliment. To place trust in a machine, especially one that seems to rule over human activity, something that unsettles many in the Curia. But Rome, like time itself, marches forward. The Vatican had its first recorded mechanical clock. We don't know the name of the builder, but we know the room, the Torre dei Venti, the Tower of the Winds, a small octagonal chamber built not for telling time, but for measuring it, and not in the way you might think. The tower was part of the Vatican's early astronomical observation efforts. It had a meridian lined, just a beam of light passing through a hole, crossing the floor at noon. A solar marker, and near it, humming quietly, was a machine. It had gears, weights, a slow, creaking mechanism that had been brought in not by theologians, but by scientists, Jesuits, mostly men whose job it was to reconcile the sky with Scripture. The church was not just watching time now. It was tracking it because of one thing, the date of Easter. You see, in the 16th century, the Julian calendar introduced by Julius Caesar was running behind by about 10 days. That doesn't sound like much, but for the church, which calculated Easter based on equinoxes and lunar cycles, it was a disaster. And so Pope Gregory XIII, in 1582, authorized something daring, a new calendar. And how did they build it? Which came from devices, clocks, solar measurements, gears that turned, not just with time, but with intention, somewhere in the upper floors of the Apostolic Palace. A machine began keeping track of the heavens. By the early 1600s, the Vatican had become quietly mechanical, and though few visitors ever saw it, there was one device installed in a back corner chamber near the papal apartments that would become legend. It wasn't big, just a cube of oak with iron reinforcements. Inside, 3 weights, a pendulum added later, gears, wound with key and hand. It rang no bells, it ticked softly, but what it did was astonishing. It tracked the sidereal day. That is, not the 24-hour solar day you and I know, but the actual rotation of the Earth's 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds. Why did the church need that? Because of the stars, to calculate the position of the moon during Holy Week, to ensure the Easter date was not just tradition, but celestial. The machine became known in obscure Vatican logs as the Antiquus Sidereus Horologium, the ancient star clock. Most popes ignored it, but a few, especially the scientifically minded ones, like Pope Benedict XIV in the 1700s, defended its place in the palace, not because it was beautiful, but because it worked. By 1773, when the Jesuits were temporarily suppressed, most of their machines were seized, destroyed, or repurposed. But this one, it stayed quiet, still, tucked behind a cabinet, possibly even mistaken for furniture. But it kept turning, and the stars, it seemed, kept listening. In the 19th century, when Italy was unified and the Papal States shrank to the walls of the Vatican, the machine was mostly forgotten. Electric clocks had begun to replace weight-driven ones, and the Vatican, while slow to adopt modernity, quite installed them too. But the ancient star clock remained. Its key was wound by a single monk brother, Maurizio, a Benedictine timekeeper, who left no records of it except one sentence, scribbled in a margin of a calendar. The old one still runs, Teve, when we do not. And then came 1939. The world was preparing for war, and inside the Vatican, change was coming too. Pope Pius XI had died that February. Successor, Eugenio Pasolini, now Pope Pius XII, was organizing the papal apartments, and among the many unnecessary items flagged for removal was an old box. It was heavy, full of wheels. No one could say what it was for anymore. And so, one quiet morning in March 1939, it was lifted onto a wooden cart, wheeled down a corridor, taken to the Spicola Vaticanata Vatican Observatory. There, it was disassembled for study. Its purpose, its age, unclear. The logs simply note, removed. One sidereal apparatus, origin indeterminate. The ancient star clock was never reassembled. The parts now sit in a cabinet. It's unlabeled, and no one has asked about it since. But the questions remain: who built it? Why did it matter? And what other machines lie hidden in rooms behind the dome? The dome. You imagine it. A long corridor, marble cold underfoot, walls damp with time. A hallway no tourist walks. A door unmarked. Inside, the smell of metal and dust. What you're looking at isn't a relic. It's not holy. It's not even beautiful. It's a box dot, and yet it holds something more than just springs and gears. It holds a question that the Vatican never wanted answered aloud. What does it mean when a machine knows more than a man? To understand the importance of the ancient star clock, you have to understand what it wasn't. It wasn't built for grandeur. No sweeping hour hands gilded in gold. Oh, chiming bells that rang out across St. Peter's Square. It didn't command. Core. It whispered, but in its quiet persistence, the machine challenged centuries of thinking. 'Cause this was not a sundial, where light measured divine time. It was not a clepsydra or water clock, where time trickled away like a mortal soul. It was something new. It tracked the stars, and that was dangerous, because in the Middle Ages and well beyond, the heavens weren't just objects of science. They were the realm of God. To measure them mechanically, without faith, without prayer, was to flirt with hubris. But the machine didn't care. It just ticked. Let's go back. In the late 16th century, a man named Giuseppe Biancani, a Jesuit astronomer and mathematician, began proposing the use of sidereal time to enhance celestial observations in Rome. He wasn't alone. In Spain, England, and the Holy Roman Empire, Mechanical innovations were popping up in cathedral towers, monastery workshops, even inside castle libraries. Gears, escapements, balances. But in the Vatican, there was caution, because while the Vatican used such machines to calculate Easter, it rarely displayed them. They were tools, not treasures, and for most within the church, they were to remain behind closed doors. It wasn't just humility, it was control. If time could be measured without theology, what else could? Could salvation be charted? Could confession be timed? Could the Pope's authority, grounded in divine rhythm, be undermined by metal teeth and spinning wheels? These were not theoretical questions. They were real and dangerous. The ancient star clock became a compromise, a quiet tool in a quiet room, tended only by trusted clerics. It wasn't written about in papal bulls. It wasn't shown to ambassadors. Didn't even have a name until centuries later. But it worked. Every 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds completed a cycle. Every time the earth turned once under the stars, Kier returned home. It told astronomers when to look for certain constellations. It told calendar reformers when to adjust leap years. It even told papal architects the right moment to design shadow lines in frescoes, lining art with heaven. And yet, no one outside the walls knew it existed. Then came the Enlightenment, and, with its skepticism, machines were no longer humble servants. They were promises, and they were replacing the old order. Clocks now governed city squares. They organized train timetables, court appointments, business hours. They no longer whispered. They shouted, and the Vatican, so slow to move, began to fall behind. The ancient star clock became a relic within its own time. It wasn't precise enough for modern science. It wasn't grand enough for display. It's obsolete. But still, it ticked because one man, Brother Maurizio, refused to let it die. Who was Brother Maurizio? Almost nothing is known. His name appears only twice in Vatican records. Once as a custodian of instruments, and once in 1936 when he signed for new oil to maintain an unnamed gearbox in the papal library. No journal, no memoir, just a man with a key, a cloth, and a habit worn thin by time. He may have been the last person to truly understand the machine. And when he passed away in 1938, there was no one left to wind it. The following year, Vatican archivists began cataloging unused items. They were preparing for modernization. New electrical clocks had been installed in the Apostolic Palace. The Swiss Guard now used wristwatches. Even the College of Cardinals had standardized schedules for conclaves and ceremonies. And then came the note. One item, mechanical, possibly astronomical, no longer required. Suggest relocation. No fanfare, no funeral, just a line in an inventory, and so the ancient star clock, silent for the first time in centuries, was packed up at the Spicola Vaticana, or Vatican Observatory. The machine was unpacked on a dusty workbench. The astronomers, by now mostly Jesuit scholars again, were confused. Some thought it was a relic from the Galileo affair. Others guessed it was a prototype for calendar reform. None could agree, and so they opened it. Inside, they found a wooden frame reinforced with iron corners, 3 suspended weights, one heavier than the others, a brass escapement, mechanism primitive but intact, a pendulum mount likely added in the 1700s, and a set of strange gear ratios, calibrated not to 24 hours, but to sidereal time. It was clear this was not a domestic clock. It's not a ceremonial one either. It was observational. It was built for a sky. It's no longer visible from Rome's crowded skies. They made notes, drawings, filed reports, and then silence. The parts were placed into a drawer, the drawer into a cabinet, the cabinet locked. It hasn't been opened since. No plaque, no label, no reconstruction, just a half-remembered rumor. That old thing they took out before the war, and so the clock is gone. But the questions linger. Who first built it? Was it Biancani himself? Was it modified across centuries by different hands? Popes know of it. Or did it survive by being forgotten? What did it mean to those who wound it? And why, of all years, was it removed in 1939? Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was necessity. Maybe it was something more. Because in 1939, the world was about to explode. And perhaps the Vatican ancient, in changing, felt the pressure to modernize just a little faster, to leave behind the par, gear, and the pendulum, to embrace the electric hum of the 20th century. But in doing so, it left behind more than a machine. It left behind a rhythm, a philosophy, a bridge between heaven and earth, built not of stone or scripture, but of brass, and now it sleeps. You imagine the drawer. Dust gathers in its seams. The hinges creak in a forgotten rhythm. Inside rests a heap of brass wheels, not unlike a spine now severed from its body. This is how time ends, not with fire, not with collapse, but with disuse. The ancient star clock, once wound daily in secret, now sleeps under layers of forgotten catalogs, overlooked blueprints, and the indifferent hum of electric bulbs. But what does it mean when a machine that once measured the cosmos no longer moves? And what did the church lose not in function, but in memory when the clock was removed in 1939? That's where our story ends, not in answers, but in decay. Let's open the drawer together to understand the clock's disappearance. You have to understand what 1939 really was for the world, for Rome, and especially for the Vatican. That year, Pope Pius XI died on February 10th. His successor, Pius XII, would be elected just a month later, March 2nd. But this wasn't just a transition of power. It was a recalibration under Pius XI. The Vatican had begun redefining its global image. Concordats were signed. Radio Vatican was launched in 1931, and the Lateran Treaty, signed with Mussolini in 1929, had just turned the Vatican into its own independent state. Pius XI was a figure of resistance. He denounced fascism, spoke against racism, and even criticized totalitarian control. But Pius XII, he would lead the church through the Second World War, and for that, he needed a different Vatican, a quieter one, a more neutral one, perhaps a more modern one. This was the atmosphere into which the old machine fell silent, dusty, and inconvenient. Archivists were purging the storage halls. Scholars were updating catalogs. Rooms were being rewired for electricity and ventilation, and in a climate of impending war. The church needed order, not mystery. What role was there for a gear-driven ghost from the past? And so, it was filed away, not destroyed, not preserved, just filed out, like so many relics that didn't fit the new rhythm of Rome. But let's linger on the idea of rhythm, because for centuries, rhythm was the only way to make sense of the world. The liturgical calendar, the bells of matins and vespers, the migration of stars, the rise and fall of tides. The ancient star clock didn't just measure these rhythms, it mirrored them. Its sidereal calibration told the truth of the sky, not the clock tower. And its silence wasn't failure. It was waiting for hands to wind it again, waiting for eyes that understood what it was trying to say. But there were fewer of those eyes now. Astronomy was moving on. The Vatican Observatory had moved to Castel Gandolfo to escape city lights. Even the Gregorian calendar, formed in the 16th century by papal decree, no longer needed mechanical confirmation. It had been absorbed by global timekeeping systems. Atomic clocks, not brass ones, now defined the truth. Still, there's something unsettling about the moment when a sacred object becomes merely an object, and that's what the ancient star clock had become. Not a treasure, not a threat, just inconvenient. And perhaps that's why its removal feels more profound than it should, not because of what it did, but because of what it meant. Let's imagine again. A PayPal assistant, clipboard in hand, checks a line on a page. He opens a dusty room, looks at the machine, its wheels, seized with rust, the pendulum still. He hesitates. He knows it's old, but he doesn't know why it matters. No plaque, no manual, just movement. Once, he shrugs, signs the form, orders its removal, another object to make room for progress. And with that decision, the Vatican lost a conversation with the past. We might never know who built the machine. Some believe it was assembled, gradually accumulation of repairs, modifications, updates by anonymous monks over the centuries. Others believe it may have been a singular commission, perhaps for the reform of Easter calculations during the late Renaissance, when time and astronomy were being re-examined with new mathematical eyes. One theory even suggests that it was part of a secret project during the pontificate of Pope Gregory XIII, the very man behind the Gregorian calendar, reform of 1582. But the machine was never mentioned in any official text. There were no surviving blueprints, no ceremonial unveiling, no preserved logbook of its care. It was, from beginning to end, invisible. And that's what makes it different, because unlike the great clocks of Strasbourg, Prague, or Wells Cathedral, where gears became grand performances, the ancient star clock was not made to be seen. It was made to serve, to calculate, to affirm, to guide, quietly, like the ancient mathematicians of Alexandria, whose scrolls disappeared in fire, like the Islamic polymaths of Baghdad, whose astrolabes vanished in flood and conquest. The Vatican's machine joined their legacy not as a monument, but as an afterthought, something that once spoke the language of the heavens, can't. Today, we rarely think of the Vatican as a place of mechanical curiosity. It is known for its theology, its libraries, its rituals, its silences. But perhaps that's where the machine belonged all along, in the silence. Because mechanical time, sidereal time, PayPal time, these were not always enemies. Sometimes they coexisted. And perhaps the ancient star clock was a bridge across those realms. It's easy to forget that silence too has a rhythm, that even in stillness, something ticks. And so we end where we began, not with what was lost, but with what remains. A drawer, a gear, a ghost of time, waiting, still. You wake slowly, your mind still half inside the dream. A dream of soft bells echoing off stone corridors, curved ceiling overhead, frescoes of stars, and in the corner of the room, a low ticking sound. It was coming from a wooden box. A long, strange machine, neither clock nor calendar. Its metal parts wound around a crescent-shaped dial. Above the dial sat a panel etched with moons, some full, some waning, and below it, tiny slits where parchment slips had once been fed in and pulled out. This was no ordinary timepiece, and it was no ordinary moon. It was the Paschal moon, the moon that determined the date of Easter. And the machine, it was built to find that moon again and again across centuries of darkness. Let's begin with a problem that plagued the church for over 1,000 years. When should Easter be celebrated? It's a simple question, right? But not so in the early centuries of Christianity. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities across the Roman Empire were deeply divided. Some wanted to celebrate Easter on 14 Nisan, the date of the Jewish Passover, regardless of the day of the week. Others insisted it must always fall on a Sunday to mark the resurrection. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE finally intervened, issuing a rule: Easter must fall on the first Sunday after the first full moon following the spring equinox. This seemed like a solution, but it wasn't, because the Julian calendar didn't match the actual lunar cycles, and even worse, drifted against the solar year. So for centuries, monks and scholars across Christendom struggled to calculate the correct date. Every year, it was a battle of tables, formulas, astronomy, sedition. This is where the Vatican stepped in. They needed a reliable, mechanical method to predict the Paschal full moon, in sometime between the 1400s and 1600s. They quietly built a machine to do just that. It would become one of the Vatican's best-kept tools, and eventually, one of its best, forgotten. Imagine it. A long wooden housing, shaped like a coffin, but topped with polished brass. Up one end, a winding crank. At the other, a display of the lunar cycle, 29.5 days. From new moon to new moon dot, the machine was known internally by many names. Some called it the lunarium, others the computus regulator. But the term most often scribbled in marginal notes was simply la tavola della luna, the table of the moon. Inside were hundreds of interlocking gears. Some moved the lunar dial, others adjusted for leap years. One rare gear even simulated the 19-year metonic cycle, a discovery made in ancient Greece that allowed lunar phases to repeat on the same solar dates. This meant the machine didn't just track the moon, it predicted it, and that made it powerful, because whoever could predict the moon could fix the date of Easter and set the rhythm of the entire Christian year. The Tavola della Luna was kept in a locked cabinet in the papal sacristy, not on display, not for public use. Only certain canon astronomers and ecclesiastical mathematicians had access. The machine was delicate, not meant to be moved. Each year, the church would consult it when preparing the Ordo Recitandi, the official liturgical guide sent to bishops around the world. Most bishops never knew the source. They received the dates in ink, printed cleanly, without a trace of the gears that calculated them. It was a quiet miracle. A calendar kept not by the stars alone, but by a box of brass teeth. But time wears even on TIMEKEEPERS. By the early 1700s, the machine's readings were said to be slightly off. Clerks noted tiny discrepancies. One moon too early, one Sunday too late. It wasn't the machine's fault. It was the calendar. Remember, by this time, the Gregorian calendar had replaced the Julian system. Leap years were skipped in new ways. The equinox had shifted by a handful of hours. The Tavola della Luna calibrated centuries earlier could no longer keep up, but it wasn't discarded. It was retired, placed into deep storage beneath the Vatican library, and like so many sacred instruments, it became a relic, one of function, then of memory, then of dust. Centuries passed. The Vatican modernized Easter calculations, moved to printed tables, then to published almanacs. Then, eventually, to digital systems. No one needed a hand-cranked moon box anymore, but it was still there on the shelf, its last caretakers long dead, until 1939 that year. Amidst the reshuffling of the papal offices, a new archivist stumbled upon it. He wasn't sure what it was. There were no labels, no instructions, just a long brass instrument covered in a linen cloth. When they opened it, the gears were rusted but intact. The dials were frozen. The metonic disc had cracked. They called in a mechanical historian from the Vatican Observatory. His name was Fr. Ernesto Tardini, Jesuit trained in both engineering and Latin astronomy. He examined it quietly for days. On the third day, wrote one sentence in his notebook: "A forgotten instrument of holy time. Let it rest." The next morning, the machine was sealed in a crate, assigned a storage number, and placed in the sala di metallo of the room of metal. No one has seen it since. And yet, something lingers, because when modern scholars read old Vatican Easter calculations, they sometimes find odd alignments, dates that match neither the Julian nor Gregorian formulas, yet they align, eerily, with the metonic cycle, as if someone, long ago, was still winding that machine in secret, still listening to the moon. In the Vatican today, Easter is fixed by decree, printed and posted. But the ghost of the Tavola della Luna still ticks, not in time, but in memory, and in the quiet question that lingers: what else did the moon machine know that we have now forgotten? You sit quietly in a darkened chamber, its stone walls thick with the silence of old decisions. Outside, the rhythms of daily life go on, bells tolling, candles flickering, monastics shuffling along worn tiles. But inside, another rhythm unfolds, not of men, but of orbs, sun and moon, light and shadow. The two ancient clocks that once competed not just for dominance over time, but for the very soul of the church. For centuries, the Christian world lived in the delicate balance between two conflicting calendars, one ruled by the sun, the other by the moon. And for those inside the Vatican who tried to measure eternity with gears and quills, this rivalry was more than astronomical. It was theological, political, exhausting, and at times quietly heretical. Let's go back, long before the Tavola della Luna was assembled, before it even needed to exist. Christian timekeeping was a tangled web of traditions. On one side were the solar calendars, the legacy of the Romans. Neat, ordered, rational. 12 months marching steadily from January to December, keeping pace with the solar year. It made civic planning possible. It governed imperial taxes. It helped ships sail, crops be planted, and armies be mobilized. On the other side were the lunar calendars drawn from Jewish tradition, observant, mystical, irregular. The moon's phases were sacred, each new crescent marking a holy beginning, each full orb illuminating a festival, each dark night of the moon a time of waiting. The early Christian community, emerging from Jewish roots, had honored the lunar pattern deeply, but Easter, the most sacred day in the Christian year, was caught between them. Was it to be celebrated according to the solar calendar, with dates fixed and repeatable, or by the lunar calendar, echoing the timing of Passover, determined anew each year by the full moon after the equinox? The Council of Nicaea in 325 tried to resolve the issue. Easter would be celebrated on the first Sunday following the Paschal full moon, itself defined as the first full moon after the vernal equinox. But the solution required something nearly impossible in the 4th century: an accurate, shared method to calculate lunar phases and align them with a solar calendar that was, even then, already drifting out of sync with the actual sun. The next 1,000 years were marked by a strange and sleepy kind of war, a war of tables, of parchment, of monks scribbling over candlelight, trying to reconcile the heavens. In Ireland, the monks of Iona used a method based on an 84-year lunar cycle. In Alexandria, Christian scholars followed a method based on the 19-year Metonic cycle. In Rome, the Julian calendar formed the backbone of civic life, but it slowly drifted, losing roughly 11 minutes each year. By the 1500s, the equinox was more than 10 days off. This wasn't just a clerical inconvenience. It meant Easter was no longer in spring. The holiest day was moving, seasonally and spiritually, out of sync with the resurrection itself. Something had to be done, and the Vatican, long known for moving slowly, acted decisively. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII implemented what is now called the Gregorian calendar. It corrected the Julian drift by skipping 10 days. Thursday, October 4th, 1582, was followed immediately by Friday, October 15. It also altered leap year rules. Century years would no longer be leap years, less divisible by 400. So 1600 remained a leap year. But 1700, 1800, and 1900 did not. This reform realigned the calendar with the sun, but it created a new problem. Not everyone adopted it. Catholic countries like Spain, Portugal, and Italy made the switch immediately, but Protestant nations resisted, some for over a century. Britain and its colonies, including future America, didn't adopt a Gregorian calendar until 1752. By then, 11 days had to be skipped to realign. For Eastern Orthodox Christians, the Julian calendar is still used for liturgical purposes. To this day, some Orthodox Easters occur on different dates than their Western counterparts. This split matters because the Tavola della Luna, Catholic in origin, was built at a time when unity in liturgical timing was increasingly important, and the Vatican, always careful about appearances, needed a tool that didn't just tell time, but told time correctly, consistently, and authoritatively. The moon machine was born not simply to calculate, but to settle disputes, quietly. It allowed the Vatican to determine Easter without relying on external astronomers, heretical calendars, or confused bishops. It wasn't just about the moon. It was about control. There's something curious, though. Despite all these calendar reforms, despite the papal decrees and scientific instruments, the Church never truly gave up the lunar legacy. Every Easter is still tied to the moon. Ash Wednesday, Lent, Holy Week, all of it, cascades from that one full moon date. It's a ghost of older time. A whisper from when fishermen in Galilee looked at the sky, not their sundials, to begin their Sabbaths. The Vatican's own machines like the Tavola della Luna carried this ancient tension in their gears. Sun and moon, equinox and Passover, rationality and mysticism. In the early 1700s, as Enlightenment ideas began creeping even into religious circles, debates flared again. Why still rely on a lunar approximation? Why not fix Easter to a Sunday in April, like the 2nd or 3rd? It would make publishing schedules easier. It would harmonize calendars. It would remove the Church's dependence on complex astronomical data. In 1923, an international conference in Geneva even proposed a fixed-date Easter. The Vatican declined, and so the moon remained. And so, too, did the Tavola della Luna, still occasionally consulted, even if unofficially. There's a story, quiet and possibly apocryphal, told by a retired archivist, that in the 1930s, just before it was cratered away, the machine was tested one last time. A curious deacon, having heard of the old device, wound its crank slowly. The gears turned. The crescent dial moved across its arc, and with a soft click, a little door opened at the bottom, revealing a parchment strip printed in faded ink. Easter, 1943, April 25th. He laughed. That was one of the latest possible dates Easter could ever fall on. But then, years later, as the war raged and schedules shifted, the deacon remembered that slip. And when the Vatican eventually declared Easter, 1943, to fall on April 25th, he felt a chill. Had the machine still worked? Had it predicted correctly? Or was it just coincidence? The answer was never pursued. The machine, by then, had been boxed and buried. Its gears no longer turned. But the mystery remained. You begin to see now how the machine's purpose, while mechanical, was deeply theological. Not just about dates, but about meaning. Not just about tracking time, but about defining it. And in doing so, defining the rhythm of devotion, fasting, feasting, and remembrance in the quiet hallways of the Vatican, where decisions take decades and symbols linger for centuries. Machines like these are not tools. They're relics of governance, of belief, and of the Church's enduring attempt to hold the sky in a box. But one question remains. The Tavola della Luna was designed to mark the moon so faithfully. Why was it really removed in 1939? And where exactly was it taken? By 1939, the Vatican had become something more than just a religious seat. It was now a sovereign microstate, a diplomatic engine, a city within a city where clocks ticked slightly differently, not just metaphorically, but physically. Behind those frescoed walls, a silent war had long simmered between the symbolic and the scientific. between ritual and reason, and into this quiet struggle, the Tavola della Lunate, ancient mechanical calendar, found itself an anachronism. Some said the machine had fallen out of use simply because of modern calculations. After all, by the early 20th century, Vatican scholars had access to increasingly precise astronomical data. Lunar cycles could be predicted with startling accuracy using trigonometric functions and standardized timekeeping. No need for brass, gears, and waxed parchment when slide rules and tables sufficed. But those who knew the rhythms of the Curia also knew something else. The Vatican never removed things merely because they were obsolete. In the papal halls, irrelevance was no reason for disappearance. Obsolete things were reclassified, recontextualized, even venerated. They were never discarded. So why did the Tavola della Luna vanish? And why of all years was it taken in 1939? To understand the disappearance, you must first understand the quiet revolution occurring beneath the Vatican itself, quite literally underground. In 1939, excavations began under St. Peter's Basilica. The official goal was the construction of a tomb for Pope Pius XI, who had died in February of that year. But behind that public objective was a deeper ambition to uncover the original tomb of St. Peter himself, supposedly located beneath the main altar of the basilica. This initiative, known today as the Vatican Necropolis excavation, was one of the most delicate archaeological operations ever undertaken by the Church. The project had to be done in secret so as not to disturb the faithful or spark theological controversy. The idea that the tomb might not be where the Church had always claimed it was could shake centuries of tradition, and yet dig they did, day by day. Engineers and laborers cleared away soil beneath the Vatican, unearthing ancient mausoleums and pagan tombs dating back to the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Roman frescoes, broken urns, old inscriptions, all carefully cataloged under torchlight, far from the public eye, in this atmosphere of subterranean mystery. The Tavola della Luna was quietly boxed and removed from the room it had occupied for over 3 centuries. It was never mentioned in public reports, never photographed during its departure, never listed in official inventories of displaced artifacts. To this day, no one will confirm where it went. And some whisper that it was moved, not because it was obsolete, but because it knew too much. There is a long-standing Vatican legend rarely spoken aloud, but passed among Kivas like a nervous tick. The Tavola della Luna contained a final cycle, a mechanical marker, a final dial. Some believe it was added during the reign of Pope Sixtus V in the late 16th century, when the Church briefly flirted with encoding apocalyptic prophecies into astronomical charts. Others claim it was a much older addition, possibly by monastics who had seen the sky as more than just a calendar, who had seen it as a mirror of divine will. Whatever the truth, the rumor goes like this: at a certain point in the future, perhaps a century ahead, perhaps more, the gears of the moon machine would align in a rare configuration. The dials would settle, the arc would click, and the mechanism would cease, not break, not malfunction, but stop as if reaching its intended conclusion, as if time itself, at least the Church's version of it, had run its course in the months before the machine was removed. A few curious entries began appearing in the Vatican's internal astronomical logs, small notes, observations. One line in particular still survives in a private annotation from 1938, scrawled in the margins of a parchment folder: Luna tabula terminus occurrit, Keurig, Aprilis MCML. The table of the moon reaches its end. April 1950. No further elaboration, but enough, perhaps, to raise concern. The outbreak of World War II in September 1939 provided a convenient distraction. As Europe descended into violence, the Vatican deepened its internal focus. Archives were sealed, documents reorganized, artifacts moved. Some say the Tavola della Luna was placed in a crate and relocated to the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive, today known as the Apostolic Archive. Others believe it was quietly dismantled and its components repurposed. But there's a third theory, that the machine now resides in one of the Vatican's clock rooms, a small set of hidden chambers beneath the Apostolic Palace where dozens of timekeeping devices are stored. Sundials, astrolabes, mechanical clocks gifted by monarchs and emperors. The rooms are off limits to nearly everyone. No visitor tours, no photos, no records of inventory accessible to outsiders. And within those rooms, nestled among the tickings of obsolete machines, the Tavola della Luna might still sit, silent, waiting. Why would the Vatican want to hide such a machine? Some suggest it was about control. After all, if a centuries-old mechanism could accurately predict lunar cycles and Easter dates far into the future, it could challenge the Church's narrative of divine discernment. If a machine could do it, why consult the bishops? Others whisper about more mystical reasons. The machine had a way of suggesting odd dates, feast days aligning with eclipses, lunar markers that coincided with rare planetary alignments, the sort of things that stirred old fears of portents, things best left unspoken. But perhaps the simplest reason is the most human. The machine was old, heavy, intricate, embarrassingly mechanical in a world becoming digital. It didn't belong anymore, and yet it could not be thrown away. It had seen too much. Today, the Vatican uses standard astronomical calculations to determine the date of Easter. Computers, not gears. Tables, not turntables. And yet, mistakes still happen in 2019. A memo was briefly circulated that had miscalculated the Paschal full moon by 1 day. The error was caught, quietly corrected. No scandal, but one official, upon seeing the misprint, reportedly said, "We should have asked the old machine." What does this tell us? It's that even in an institution dedicated to eternity, time is a fragile thing, measured not just by instruments, but by faith. Not just by the moon, but by meaning. The Tavola della Luna may no longer tick, but its legacy persists subtly, visibly like the moon itself behind a veil of clouds. You cannot see it, but you know it's there, always pulling at the tides of history. In the narrow alleyways behind the Vatican's Apostolic Palace, where the cobblestones are uneven and the stone walls weep with centuries of Rome's humid breath, there once lived a man whose name has been almost entirely forgotten. He wasn't a cardinal. He wasn't a pope. He wasn't even a priest. He was a clockmaker, a quiet man with a lopsided hat and permanent ink stains on his fingertips. His shop, no larger than a stable, sat nestled between a wine cellar and a bakery. And if you had wandered down that lane in the mid-17th century, you might have mistaken his home for little more than a tool shed. But behind its weather-beaten door, lit by oil lamps and surrounded by stacks of vellum drawings, gears the size of coins, hand wheels whose teeth were cut by hand, was one of the strangest Vatican projects ever to be entrusted to a layman. His name was Giovanni Rinaldi, and in 1656, he was summoned to help the church do something it had never done before: measure time from the inside. This was not Rinaldi's first encounter with sacred work. His father had been a sundial mason, one of those medieval artisans who etched gnomons into the marble courtyards of monasteries. Giovanni had learned early that time was both a thing to be watched and a thing to be feared. He also learned that most people never noticed it till it was already too late. Giovanni's early commissions were simple: restore an abbey bell tower, recalibrate a convent's water clock, adjust the flow rate in a Cistercian hourglass. But His designs grew more ambitious with time. In one preserved letter, he mused about building a time organ, a machine that would not chime hours, but sing them. He never built it. But the sketches survived. It was one of those sketches that caught the eye of Cardinal Benedetti, who oversaw the Vatican's internal libraries and mechanical records. Benedetti, a man of strict habits and secret curiosities, invited Rinaldi to Rome for what was initially described as a consultation. Rinaldi thought he'd be cleaning rust from an old tower clock. Instead, he found himself standing in front of an empty chamber in the Vatican library basement with a single instruction: build something that keeps God's time. What did that mean? Rinaldi asked. Benedetti gave no answer. He pointed to a worn piece of parchment tacked to the stone wall. It contained a list of times: matins, lauds, prime terce, sext, none, vespers, complenis were the 8 canonical hours, sacred markers that structured monastic life. Time wasn't a continuous flow in the church. It was a series of interruptions, breathings, rhythms, and the church wanted something to embody that. Not a bell tower to ring, not a clock to chime, but a machine that could live these hours, experience them, even if no human monk was nearby. Giovanni understood immediately. He called it a clock for the soul. For the next 9 years, he worked in near silence. He constructed the machine by hand, every gear filed, every shaft oiled with lamp fat and beeswax. But it wasn't just mechanical. It was monastic. Each canonical hour had its own mechanism. When terce approached, usually mid-morning, the machine did not simply chime. A miniature scroll unfurled, displaying a verse from the Psalms. A small internal box released a wisp of incense. The room filled with the scent of myrrh. At vespers, the lighting inside the casing dimmed gradually, using a system of sliding, smoked glass panels, mimicking the sun's descent behind a basilica dome. No one had ever built anything like it. It wasn't meant to tell time. It was meant to fill time. Rinaldi did not inscribe his name on it. He did not date the final drawing. He left a single line scribbled beneath the winding diagram: Tempeste est sic flamma in corde. God's time is like a flame in the heart. The machine was placed inside a hidden alcove of the Confessio, beneath St. Peter's Basilica, the same area where tradition holds that St. Peter's bones rest. Its role was quiet. It marked the hours for the confessors who sat there all day, hearing secrets no man should ever bear alone. When lauds arrived at dawn, it whispered a prayer using a rotating drum and friction-edged parchment. When Compline fell at night, it extinguished its own oil lamp. By the 18th century, no one remembered who had made it, but confessors still relied on it. Its sounds and rhythms became background music to centuries of penance, until one day it simply stopped. In the early 1800s, during the Napoleonic occupation of Rome, French officers raided the Vatican in search of valuables. They took manuscripts, gold, religious relics. They stumbled upon the clock for the soul in a shadowed niche. No jewels, no gold leaf, brass, wood, and silent gears. They ignored it, but the damage had been done. The alcove was disturbed. The mechanism jarred. A dust settled on its prayer drum, jamming the gears. The oil lamp leaked. No one repaired it. For the next 100 years, it sat quietly in the dark, surrounded by the whisper of footsteps, the low voice of priests, and the constant hum of time slipping by. No one knew how to start it again. In 1928, an engineer named Luigi Castellini, working on restoration plans for Vatican infrastructure, stumbled upon a set of blueprints filed under the vague label Chrono Spiritualis Non Bell. He traced the lines, recognized the craftsmanship, then found the basement behind the Confessio, a dark wooden case covered in dust. He opened it. The machine was still intact, but something strange happened. When Castellini tried to wind it, it resisted. The gears wouldn't budge. The spring felt tense, as if already full. He feared breaking it, so he left it. A year later, Castellini died suddenly from pneumonia. No one followed up the clock, for the soul vanished again into the background. To this day, Vatican guides do not mention the mechanism. Few know its story. Fewer still understand what it was meant to do. But once in a while, especially during Vespers, when the air is still and the last shafts of Roman sun filter through the domes, some priests say they hear something. A faint click, a shift in the stone, a soft, almost inaudible hiss, like incense released in an empty room, as if, somewhere in the shadows, a clock is still trying to feel the hours, trying to breathe them, trying to remind the confessors that even in the silence, time remains sacred. The clock had long since fallen silent. The Vatican's corridors had a way of storing echoes. It was 1953, and the church was in the midst of modernizing. In the era of transistor radios and atomic clocks, there was no longer patience for candlelit archives or cobwebbed alcoves. The Gregorian reforms of centuries past had shaped the calendar, but now, key to Vatican found itself reckoning with something more stubborn, its forgotten machines. Enter Father Emilio Varone, a Jesuit trained, not in scripture first, but in physics. He wore his collar like an afterthought. His first degree had been in mechanical engineering, his second in the thermodynamics of precision oscillators. His theology came last hand, some whispered begrudgingly. He was not interested in relics, nor particularly reverent of old devices, but he had a task: conduct a comprehensive audit of Vatican's timekeeping instruments for an upcoming PayPal proposal to regulate the chiming of bells across Rome. It was meant to be simple, an administrative review, just paperwork, that is, until he found the plans for Chrono Spiritualis non-bell. The label intrigued him. The first few pages were unremarkable: hand-drawn gears, brass frames, a winding core. But deeper in the file, the sketches turned strange. One page diagrammed a scroll drum wrapped in handwritten prayers. Another showed a mirrored cylinder designed to reflect candlelight onto an etched plate of verses, marking the passing hours, not by shadow, but by shifting reflection. It was poetry disguised as mechanics. Varone was not amused. Emotional theatrics. He muttered into the quiet reading room of the Jesuit Curious Archive. This isn't timekeeping, it's storytelling. Still, something in him shifted. It wasn't belief, it was professional irritation. Who had built this? Why had it never been cataloged in any engineering archive? Why had no PayPal records ever mentioned its installation? He needed to see it. A week later, under PayPal authorization, Father Varone was led into a sub-basement beneath St. Peter's Basilica. The floor was uneven. The air tasted of rust. It was a monk named Brother Anselmo who guided him, an archivist from an obscure order tasked with maintaining sacramental inventory. Anselmo didn't say much, but when they reached a small recessed wall behind the confessio, he paused and looked at Varone as if to say, "You don't open something like this lightly." Varone ignored the glance. He pulled off the cloth cover, and there it was. A dark, wooden casing, half devoured by dust and time. Brass fittings, dulled with tarnish. A central wheel with hand-filed teeth. A cracked glass plate revealing what seemed to be a tangle of gears, pulleys, and waxed string. No maker's mark. No plaque dot. Just a single etched phrase on the base, almost faded into invisibility. Tempeste est secat flamma in corde. God's time is like a flame in the heart. Varone rolled his eyes. Romantic nonsense. But his hands trembled slightly as he began to examine the casing. The machine, surprisingly, was still intact, even after 200 years of disuse. The scroll, drum wound tight around a brass core, bore faint traces of inked psalms in Latin. He turned it gently and saw Veni, Creator, Spiritus. Then the gear shifted. A click, the faintest release of Eris, if a long dead breath had escaped. Varone stepped back. He spent the next week carefully documenting every component. He made diagrams, comparisons, even tried tracing the manufacturing technique of the gear teeth. None matched any known Italian horological style of the 17th century. It was as if Giovanni Rinaldi had invented his own clock-making dialect, one lost completely to time. Varone's notes began filling with contradictions. The T's, a mechanical memory system, the scroll that predated the Jacquard loom. Its incense release trigger employed a wax-sealed piston, much like primitive thermostats. Its light reflection drum used techniques more common in camera obscura chambers than in clocks. He wrote, "This is not an attempt to measure time. It is an attempt to ritualize it. This machine doesn't tell you the hour. It feels it." Then he added, "I think I hate it." But hate often masks fascination. He couldn't stop thinking about it. For a week, he skipped morning mass, sat alone in the Jesuit Curia garden at dusk, replaying each mechanism in his mind. He began waking at odd hours, writing half sentences in his notebooks. Why oil the drum if it cannot move? Why a mirror? Whose face did it reflect? If the machine no longer works, why does the air feel warmer near it? Varone was trained to dismiss such thoughts, but they lingered, like static, like a tune you couldn't place. He finally confessed his unease to his mentor, Father Matteo, man even older than the Vatican clocks themselves. Father Matteo listened patiently, then offered a parable. A fisherman once built a net so fine it could catch the wind. He never did, of course, but the net still moved. Varone stared. Father Matteo smiled. "You're asking why a machine feels sacred when it shouldn't. I ask, why does that disturb you so much?" One night Varone returned alone to the confessio. This time he brought tools. He adjusted the brass arms, applied new wax to the internal piston, rewound the scroll, aligning it with Ter's the third hour of prayer. Traditionally, around mid-morning, he lit the old lamp, now retrofitted with an electric bulb hidden inside. Then he waited. A minute passed. Nothing. Then 5. Still nothing. Then 10 minutes. In the scroll shifted. One word revealed itself. Exaudi. Hear me. Varone froze. There was no wind, no vibration. The gears had moved on their own. A moment later, the incense chamber hissed. Just a puff of stale air, but still. He stepped back. He didn't believe in ghosts or miracles, but he was beginning to understand something else entirely. This was not a clock that measured time. It was a language, K, and no one had spoken it in centuries. News of his discovery was not welcomed. Cardinal dismissed it as mechanical superstition. A Vatican engineer accused Varone of planting the mechanism. His own order grew suspicious, wondering why a Jesuit physicist was spending nights with a broken toy. He was instructed to halt all investigations, but Varone refused. Instead, he'd publish a small, anonymous treatise in Latin, Tempus Ritus, on the spiritual mechanization of canonical hours. In it, he argued that ritual timekeeping had once served as the Church's invisible nervous system, that machines like Rinaldi's were not curiosities, but essential tools in helping salated monks maintain internal rhythm, and that, perhaps, we had grown too attached to linear clocks, those that marched on, regardless of meaning, forgetting the sacred slowness of ecclesiastical time. The book gained a small following among Benedictine scholars, but it never reached the Vatican mainstream. In 1956, Father Varone was reassigned to Argentina. He died 6 years later in Buenos Aires. His manuscripts scattered across several Jesuit libraries to this day. The Rinaldi machine, as some now call it, remains in its alcove beneath Peter's Basilica. Covered, unlabeled. Visitors walk past it, unaware, but some who serve long hours in the confessio say they feel strange drafts near it, that when alone, they sometimes smell incense or see a flicker of motion in the reflection of the altar. Nothing dramatic, no miracles, just rhythm. As if somewhere behind the walls, something old is still turning, not to tell time, but to remind us that time once meant something more. By the time the 1980s arrived, the Vatican had grown weary of shadows. The post-war decades had dragged the church, often reluctantly, into the neon glow of modernity. Typewriters replaced ledgers. Fluorescent tubes buzzed where candles once flickered. Even the Vatican's internal post system was being computerized. The archives were undergoing something called rational consolidation. Everything not explicitly labeled useful, valuable, or sacred was slated for relocation, stored destruction. And that was how the file labeled Chrono Spiritualis non bell reappeared. The logbook entry was mundane, cataloged mechanism, in confessio sublivo, adjacent to unused chapel recess, possibly liturgical, review for disposal. It was signed with a date, April 14, 1981, and an initial. The RTHE name was Benedetto Ricci, an assistant administrator for the newly formed Office of PayPal Logistics. He wasn't a historian. He wasn't a priest. He was, in his words, a bureaucrat with too many shelves and not enough room. Ricci didn't recognize the name Giovanni Rinaldi, but he recognized dusting this particular corner of the basilica. Had plenty of it. So, on a humid morning that spring, he descended into the confessio chambers with 2 workmen and a flashlight. They found the machine still intact, though the brass had dulled to near black. The scent of incense was faint, but unmistakable, like something exhaled from stone. The men started to wrap it in cloth, but Ricci hesitated. He noticed a crack along the side panel, wide enough to reveal what looked like a sliver of parchment. He pulled it gently. It was fragile, dry, but still legible. The handwriting was faded, but unmistakable. Latin, in a script used by ecclesiastical engineers in the early 18th century. It read, "To measure time is to risk destroying it. To witness time is to remember who you are." There was no signature, just tiny gear drawn in the margin. Ricci didn't know what to make of it, but something about the words stuck with him. He decided, then and there, not to discard the machine. He moved it instead, not to the refuse inventory, but to a secondary storage vault used for unstable relics. There it remained unregistered, unclassified, wrapped in new linen like an ancient child. Years later, the whispers returned. The whispers came not from theologians or priests, but from CLOCKMAKERS. In 1988, an obscure horology journal in Austria published an article by a man named Karl Baumgartner, who had stumbled across an anonymous Latin manuscript in the University of Graz library. It was titled Tempus Ritus. The manuscript detailed what Baumgartner called spiritual mechanical logic, a theory suggesting that religious time could be modeled not by fixed hours, but by emotional resonance. The manuscript made reference to a mysterious scroll clock built by Giovanni Rinaldi for the Vatican, a clock that, rather than measure time with numbers, shifted readings based on spiritual needs, revealing psalms, prayers, or candlelit meditations according to unseen rhythms. Baumgartner speculated that this was not just an experiment, but an entire philosophy of timekeeping lost to ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The article gained little traction, but one copy made its way accidentally to the desk of a junior technician at the Vatican's newly reorganized Historical Preservation Office. The technician, a woman named Chiara Salviati, had grown up in Bologna, surrounded by antique clocks. She recognized the terminology. She read the piece again. Then she searched the Vatican archives, and she found the same diagram Chrono Spiritualis, non-bell, The storage number had been crossed out, but the requisition log still held Ricci's note from 1981.salviati requested access to the vault. It took 3 weeks, but eventually she was escorted beneath the basilica by 2 guards and an archivist with shaky keys. The machine was there, upped, still untouched. She unwrapped it slowly, as though peeling away a century. There, on the brass casing, just beneath the scroll drum, she found something Ricci had missed. Tiny fingerprints, grease from long ago, hardened into smudges. Proof that someone, perhaps even Rinaldi, Sylph had once touched this brass with living hands. What followed was the quiet rebirth of the Rinaldi machine. Salviati spent 4 years studying it. She consulted engineers, theologians, and even music historians, trying to decode the rhythmic logic of the scroll's movement. Her notes described the machine as a meta-clock, not a device to track hours, but to translate them. She theorized that the internal scroll had originally been rotated not by gears, but by a small thermal engine powered by heat fluctuations, possibly even from candlelight. The prayers revealed were not on a timer, but triggered by temperature, light angle, or the motion of a nearby observer. The machine was less like a bell tower and more like a monastic companion, quiet, servant, and reactive. By 1993, Salviati's work was complete. She submitted a 210-page report titled Rinaldi's Liturgical Machine on the Theology of Time. It caused a minor scandal, not because of her findings, but because she recommended the machine not be put on public display. Some things, she wrote, are not meant for tourists. Instead, she proposed a small private oratory be built near the Vatican Library, where monks, priests, or scholars could interact with the device in silence. The purpose, she said, was not to see the machine work, but to listen to its silence. Her proposal was accepted, quietly, without press, in 1995. The machine was moved again, this time to room 427, a chamber adjacent to the Jesuit reading room near the Biblioteca Apostolica Vatican. It was placed on a plinth, surrounded by votive, candles, and a single seat carved from walnut. No plaque, no rope, just the smell of wax and dust. Only a handful of people knew it was there, and that, perhaps, was the point. Today, the Rinaldi machine sits untouched by the public. It is maintained by 2 Benedictine monks and a technician from the Vatican Observatory. Once a month, they clean the scroll, oil the hinges, and wind the crank. Sometimes, if the room is quiet, scroll shifts and a verse reveals itself. One technician reported seeing a passage from the Psalms appear without the gears turning. Another claimed he heard a low mechanical hum after praying in the chamber for an hour. All reports are logged. None are investigated. That's the way the Church prefers it now. So, what was removed from the Vatican in 1939? Not the Rinaldi machine, but the idea that machines had no place in the sacred. In that year, during a renovation project led by Cardinal Eugene Tisserand, several mechanical devices were discarded from the Vatican crypt. Surly typewriters used for translations, clockwork astrolabes, and even experimental projection devices once used in theological lectures. The rationale was clear. These were tools of the world, not of heaven. But in their haste, they almost discarded something else, something that had no purpose, no sound, no measurable output, a machine that refused to chime, and yet somehow spoke in a world where every second is digitized and divided, where even sleep is measured in REM cycles and brainwave charts. The Rinaldi machine stands as a relic not just of the Church, but of another kind of time. Time that breathes, time that listens, time that waits. Perhaps that's why it still hasn't been dismantled, because in some corner of the Vatican, among the polished marble and roaring silence, a forgotten clock still remembers what it means to keep time for the soul, not the schedule. And, perhaps, even now, beneath the modern lights and new security systems, that brass scroll slowly turns, revealing a line from long ago. Blessed is the one who waits, though the hour is not known. By the early 1600s, the halls of the Vatican were choking on paper, scrolls, manuscripts, letters from excommunicated bishops, Arabic translations of Greek philosophy, papal bulls so old their ink had turned to dust. Documents arrived faster than they could be sorted, and the scribes, bent men with smudged fingers and unblinking eyes, worked in silence beneath gasping chandeliers. They didn't speak much. They copied. They filed. They read things no one else dared to touch. You may have heard of the Vatican secret archives, though that name is more mysterious than accurate. The Latin word secretum doesn't mean hidden. It means personal or private. These were not records of conspiracy, but of continuity. Key, births, deaths, excommunications, alliances, pages and pages of them, bound in silence and stored in stone. But sometimes the pages held more than just names. Sometimes they whispered, and in 1622, a newly elected pope tried to silence them. He was born Maffeo Barber, and by the time he rose to the papacy as Urban VIII, he was known for his intellect, his pride, and his obsession with purification. Urban saw himself not just as the head of the church, but as a reformer of its very memory. He had studied law, dabbled in poetry, and written treatises on ecclesiastical authority. To him, history was not a static ledger, but a moral battlegrounded landscape where old ideas could grow into heresies if not properly weeded out. When he looked at the secret archives, he didn't see a treasure. He saw a threat. Letters from popes who tolerated Jewish communities, records of donations from heretical kings, debates on astronomy, alchemy, and whether souls had weight. Urban did not like uncertainty. He did not like old arguments. He liked order. The year was 1624 when Urban initiated what he called the Sanctification Review. It began as a simple audit. Monks and scribes would review the oldest documents in the secret archives and determine which were edifying and which were unfit for propagation. But slowly, the review changed. Documents were not just being reviewed, they were being removed. Not burned, not destroyed, just relocated to where no one could say. A corridor on the southern end of the Apostolic Palace was sealed. It at once connected the main library to the private apartments. Now it was guarded day and night. Inside were crates, dozens of them, stamped not with titles or codes, but with the papal seal. One cardinal reportedly asked what was in the boxes. The response came from Urban's secretary, a somber man named Father Ludovico Monti. "Memories," he said. "It's too heavy for the present." One of the first things removed was a scroll known as the Thessalonian Mandate. It was a 3rd century document from a bishop in Thessaloniki who claimed to have received a vision of the Apostle Paul, warning that the division of light by lens or angle would lead to spiritual blindness. The mandate had been used in the 13th century to argue against optical experiments by Franciscan monks, but by the 1600s it was seen as superstitious nonsense. Urban, however, took it seriously, not because he feared optics, but because he feared ambiguity. The document contradicted later teachings on reason and natural law, and so it was removed. That scroll was never seen again. Over the next year, more documents vanished. A letter from a 10th century pope congratulating an Arabic scholar for his translation of Galen's Anatomy. A set of drawings showing a cross-section of Noah's Ark with labeled compartments and a plumbing system. A confession by a 14th century nun who claimed her visions came not from God, but from a fermented fig syrup given by another sister. Each item was logged. Each item was relocated. No list of the removals was made public. Not everyone agreed with Urban's efforts, One of the Vatican's chief archivists at the time, Brother Tommaso Filippi, began keeping a parallel logbook, his own record of what was being removed. He called it Liber Umbri, the Book of the Shadow. Filippi wrote carefully in narrow Latin, using recycled parchment from old calendar pages. His entries were not emotional. April 2nd, 2 scrolls removed from the Syrian collection, Presumed Reason, Preconciliar Cosmology. May 16th, bundle of 4 letters, postmarked Cairo, 1254, written by Dominican envoy, discusses lunar observations. June 12th, entire box of heretical curiosities, marked for silent study. No indication of content beyond the term mechanica. Spiritualists. That phrase appeared again, mechanica. Spiritualists. It referred to devices used in early liturgical experiments, sundials shaped like saints, teas, bells timed by dripping water, and other curiosities built by monk engineers who wanted to bring time and devotion into harmony. Urban wanted them gone. He believed salvation came through obedience, not machinery. Filippi knew he was taking a risk by documenting the removals, He was contradicting papal orders, but he believed history did not belong to one man, no matter how holy. It belonged to the slow, stubborn memory of the church hand, to that quiet voice inside stone walls that says, "Don't forget me." In December of 1625, Filippi was caught. His hidden logbook was found beneath the floorboards of his chamber, alongside a rusted compass and a small lens wrapped in wool. He was not imprisoned, but he was dismissed from his post, sent to a monastery near Mantua. No explanation given. He died 3 years later. His final recorded words were, "Everything kept lives longer than its keeper." So what happened to the documents? Some believe they were destroyed. Others believe they were hidden deeper, sealed within vaults, too obscure for even modern archivists to find. In the 1970s, during a routine humidity inspection of the Apostolic Palace, a worker discovered a door behind a false wall. The key didn't fit. The lock had rusted shut, but inside, when eventually opened, were several crates bearing seals from the 17th century. The contents included a single letter marked Tempus Ritus and a diagram resembling a complex dial surrounded by scriptural references. There were no labels, but the date matched the removals of Urban's purge. It's believed the crates were part of the Sanctification Review. Urban VIII reigned until 1644. When he died, some of his reforms were undone. Others were simply forgotten, filed away like the documents he tried to bury. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII formally reopened portions of the Vatican's secret archives to scholars, but access remained damned, still remains limited. Some files are sealed for reasons of diplomacy, others for security, and some, perhaps, because they contain ideas too strange, too delicate, too ancient to face the modern world. And somewhere, the margins of a forgotten page or the corner of a crate sealed with wax, the past still waits to be remembered. In the dim undercroft of the Apostolic Palace, below the world mosaics and creaking beams, there was once a room without a name. No marker was carved above the arch. Our keys were kept on record. The door was locked from within by a mechanism, now lost to time, and only those who knew the rhythm of the turning rods could open it. It was in this forgotten chamber, part scriptorium, part vault, that an ancient machine once stood. Not a machine in the modern sense, no wires, no steam, no electricity. It moved with gravity, water, and gears. But it was a machine nonetheless, deliberate, constructed, and designed to do something few machines in history had dared. It recorded the rhythm of prayer, and perhaps, more controversially, it may have measured the weight of the soul. 1626, a year after Urban VIII began his Sanctification Review. Word reached the Vatican of a peculiar device being held in the northern cloisters of San Giovanni in Laterano. A group of Jesuit scholars, under the patronage of a dying cardinal, had been studying an old contraption brought to Rome centuries earlier from the East, its original origin lost. Perhaps Persian, perhaps Hellenistic, or older still. The machine was described in an internal letter as a device of strange balance and sacred alignment, which turns only when one prays without distraction. At first, that was taken to be metaphorical, but the Jesuits were serious. According to their detailed observations, the device was a complex balance scale suspended over a basin of water. When the user recited specific liturgical prayers in exact sequence, droplets fell from hidden channels, adjusting the scale. The balance did not tip unless the prayer was spoken from memory and in full concentration, timing, breath, and emotion apparently affecting the outcome. They called it Memoria Machina. Urban VIII was alarmed. The Pope had no appetite for mystical machines, especially ones that hinted at automated spirituality. His reforms sought to return prayer to purity, words spoken aloud to God, not coaxed into rhythm by mechanical intercession. More dangerously, if such a machine were reland, if it could be replicated, then faith might begin to be measured. The idea that machines could quantify grace or devotion, that prayers could be tested like weights, to Urban, it was blasphemy. He ordered the machine removed from Laterano and brought into the Vatican, but not for destruction, for silence. Memoria Machina was disassembled in the sealed corridor behind the southern wing of the palace. Its parts were stored in separate crates, marked with false titles, architectural fragments, iron supports, water siphons. The Jesuits who worked on it were reassigned. Some went to missions in Brazil, others disappeared into obscure diocesan posts. One Father Ignacio de Monte wrote a brief account in his final days before expulsion. It was not a machine of miracles, it was a mirror. And men are afraid of mirrors that show too much. But what was it, really? Modern historians have speculated on the nature of the Memoria Machina. Some describe it as a kind of early biofeedback device, sensitive to moisture in breath and subtle shifts in weight. Others think it was simply a poetic metaphor misunderstood by literal-minded reformers. But there is some reason to believe the machine existed. 1929, shortly before the Lateran Treaty that created Vatican City as an independent state. A young archivist named Giuseppe Ferri was granted rare access to a sealed portion of the Apostolic Palace while cataloging obsolete legal documents. Behind a crumbling shelf, he found a leather-bound journalins signed with only the initials TF. Inside were hand-drawn schematics, gears, pulleys, counterweights, a basin described as blessed copper, and a curved brass arm marked with degrees. The last page included a note: "He who speaks from memory must not stammer. The drop will not fall if the word falters." Ferry's fine caused a brief stir, but it was quickly dismissed by church authorities as the doodlings of a monastic engineer. The journal was reshelved and quietly removed from public view, but Ferry made a copy and gave it to a colleague in Florence before his death. That copy has never surfaced. So what does all of this have to do with the purge of 1624 to 1627? Everything, because to Urban VIII, memory was not just a faculty of the mind, it was a pillar of doctrine. Faith had to be consistent, recited, verified. A man who doubted one sacrament might soon doubt them all. So, a device that relied on the strength of private memory, that literally responded to inner concentration, was dangerous. The Pope could forgive heretics, even scholars who asked foolish questions, but he could not tolerate ambiguity. And Memoria Machina was ambiguity incarnate. A thing that moved but did not explain itself. A thing that might imply God's presence could be mechanically measured or worse, absent when no movement occurred. And yet, the removal of the machine didn't erase it. Legends grew around it in whispers. By the 18th century, traveling monks in southern France told tales of a Vatican pendulum that revealed the sincerity of one's confession. In Prague, a shadowy clockmaker named Elias Urzepa wrote of a scale of devotion that could ring the hour of salvation when properly attuned. Even in 19th century England, a writer for the Edinburgh Review mentioned the strange story of the prayer machine, said to be kept under stone and key in the Vatican, far from public scrutiny, its ticking heart long quiet. Urban VIII had tried to silence a machine. Instead, he birthed a myth. But if there was such a machine, and if it measured anything real emotion, focus, spiritual intensity, then what happened to its knowledge? Was it recorded? Passed on? Or did it die in the minds of the Jesuits, forced into silence? We may never know. But deep inside the Vatican archives today, a few boxes remain labeled only with the letters MMST. No descriptions. No access granted. Just a simple note. Do not catalog. There's something haunting in that phrase, isn't there? To not catalog is to admit a mystery, to acknowledge that a thing exists, but that we do not dare to file it. In a place built to preserve memory, what does it mean to hide something from even its own librarians? Could it be that some memories are too fragile or too dangerous? In the end, it is perhaps fitting that Memoria Machina was forgotten. For in forgetting, it achieved what no machine of faith ever could. It became a test of your own memory. You have to decide what you believe, what you remember, and what you let slip away. 'Cause maybe the soul doesn't need to be weighed. Maybe it just needs to be remembered. In a place like the Vatican, silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is structured, curated, and enforced with as much care as any fresco on a chapel ceiling. It is the kind of silence that carries memory, heavy, dense, and shaped by the weight of centuries. It was into this silence that the Memoria Machina disappeared. But as with all things buried carefully and intentionally, the silence itself began to murmur. Long after Urban VIII passed from the world, and long after the Jesuits who had once studied the machine were silenced, small traces remained, not just in journals or schematics, but in something far more difficult to purge. Curiosity, the next generation of Vatican scholars, did not forget the incident, simply inherited it differently, not as open knowledge, but as rumor kind of sacred cautionary tale. Archivists who came across odd references to the device of devotion in old letters or misplaced log entries were advised quietly by elders to let the matter rest. Some prayers, they were told, are better left unanswered. And so, through gentle discouragement, the story survived not as a document, not as a file, but as a whisper that led a young seminarian named Paolo Denari to dig where others wouldn't. Paolo entered the Vatican School of Paleography. In 1883, he was quiet, meticulous, and fascinated not by saints or martyrs, but by the structure of memory itself, how it was organized, copied, stored, and most of all, lost. One afternoon, while examining a bundle of 17th century estate inventories, he found an odd page slipped into the folds of a family will. It had no relation to the rest of the document and was written in a different hand. It read, "When the voice is steady, the basin shifts, but when fear enters the tongue, the arm halts. The machine does not lie, and that is why it must be hidden." Number, name, no signature, just a date, July 5th, 1605. It meant nothing to his superiors, but to Paolo, it was enough. A crack. Over the next 3 years, he followed scattered mentions of the basin, the prayer arm, and across dusty ledges and overlooked notebooks. Many of them were fragments of phrase here, a diagram there, But over time, a pattern emerged, and at the center of that pattern was one room beneath the Hall of Benedictions. Behind a rusted iron gate marked Officina Sacra, Paolo found a forgotten workshop. Its last catalog entry dated to 1697. The room had been used, it seemed, for repairs to ceremonial thrones and ancient altar mechanisms. But on the wall, half covered by a crumbling curtain, Paolo found an engraving, a basin, a pendulum, a curved brass dial, and below it, in Latin, Memoria est Iudex, memory is the judge. The next week, Paolo was transferred to external duties in Avignon. His request to revisit the chamber was denied, and the iron gate was resealed with a new lock. Paolo never spoke of it again, not in public. But in 1919, a year before his death, he left a sealed letter with the Vatican Library. It was only opened in 1995 when a group of scholars digitizing rare manuscripts came across the notation for release after a century, or in the event of structural collapse. Inside the envelope, Paolo's notes, diagrams, and a single sentence written on linen paper. If it ever moved, it moved with us not, despite us. And that may be the most profound observation of all, because whether the Memoria Machina truly functioned, whether it ticked or tilted or weighed the saws, perhaps not the point. Its existence, real or mythologized, reflects a deeper truth that haunted the church for centuries, that human memory is not just a vessel for faith, but a test of it. Urban VIII had tried to purify the archive. He believed truth required clarity, but in doing so, he may have erased something that was not meant to be clear at all. The Memoria Machina, it existed, was not a theological device. It was a mirror. It reflected the speaker's intent, not their doctrine. It did not validate belief. It validated attention, and that may have been its greatest threat. There's a particular document stored in an unlabeled drawer near the end of Archive Hall 6B that lists objects removed from Vatican grounds in 1939 as part of what was officially termed the Ecclesiastical Material Relocation Project. Item 47 is simply labeled non-functioning liturgical mechanism, brass basin, iron pendulum, uncalibrated arm. Destination unknown. There is no further record of its existence. Some believe it was scrapped. Others whisper it was sent to a Jesuit retreat in Argentina, and a few claimed it remains in the lower vaults of the Gregorian Tower, behind walls that have not been opened since the end of the Second World War. But ask yourself this: if you were to build a machine that responded only to memory, only to focused, unbroken thought, would you want to share it, or would you bury it? 'Cause such a machine does not just measure the present. It reveals the cracks in what we remember. It exposes the moments where we pretend to believe, pretend to feel, pretend to recall, and in doing so, tells the truth not of theology, but of attention. Perhaps this is why the Church, which has always relied on repetition and ritual, found the device so troubling. Prayer is not just a communication, it is a discipline, it's a rhythm, a form. But what if that rhythm could be tested? What if a machine could show which prayers were true and which were merely repeated? What happens to faith when form is exposed as hollow? The Memoria Machina did not answer these questions. It only asked them again and again, and maybe that is why it had to be taken apart, not to destroy its parts, but to interrupt the question. And so, it sits real or imagined, the heart of a long silence. A silence not born of forgetfulness, but of choice. Because history, like faith, sometimes depends on not looking too closely, on allowing mystery to remain closed. Not because we are afraid of the answers, but because the questions make us more human, more human. You probably think of a clock as something cold, mechanical, precise, maybe even a little arrogant. A machine that dares to mark time, tick by tick, as if time could ever be tamed. But what if I told you There was once a monastery where time was not ticked, but intoned, where the hours were not measured by gears or pendulums, but by breath, by chant, by the weariness of human devotion. And what if the closest thing to a clock in that monastery wasn't a mechanism at all but a room? The story begins in the Apennines of central Italy, not in Rome, not in Florence, but in the limestone valley carved by wind and habit, far from the noise of kings and councils. It is the 14th century, and at the edge of a hill called Monte della Voce Mountain of the Voice there stands a small Benedictine monastery named Sanctum Horologium, the holy clock. But the monks who lived there would never have called it that. To them, it was simply the house. No dials, no hands, no iron bells. And yet every brother, from the novice to the abbot, would rise, kneel, chant, and break bread with a precision that defied the sun. Without ever seeing a timepiece, they lived with more temporal discipline than most kings' courts. So, how did they do it? They built a machine out of people. It started, as many strange things do, with necessity. The surrounding villages scattered and slower relied on the monastery, not just for spiritual guidance, but for order. The monks regulated planting cycles, tax days, local fasts, and feast days. The region's isolation meant that sundials were useless for half a year due to dense fog. Mechanical clocks were still a curiosity limited to wealthy cathedrals. So, the abbot, a man named Brother Marcellus, devised a system. He assigned 6 monks, one for each pair of canonical hours, matins and lauds, prime and terce, sext and none, vespers and compline. Each monk would be responsible not for ringing a bell, but for initiating a chant. The chant would echo through a series of narrow corridors and domed chambers, built with remarkable acoustic precision, so that each monk's voice would reach the next, acting as a living relay of time. If one monk was late, the echo chain broke and the rhythm of the house was disrupted. No ropes, no springs, just echo, discipline, and human breath. It was, in effect, a human clock. One made not of brass, but of lungs and faith. But it didn't. And there Brother Marcellus, whose eyesight had failed in middle age, developed an obsession with the sensory flow of time. He believed that each hour of prayer should not just be known, it should be felt. So he began adjusting the architecture itself. Stone tiles were laid into the floor with slightly different textures. One corridor with smooth marble, the next with rough sandstones, so the monks could feel where they were in time by how their bare feet moved across the earth. Oil lamps of varying scents were placed in chambers, myrrh at dawn, frankincense at noon, lavender at compline, so that each hour's prayer would have a distinct aromatic memory. Even the temperature was engineered. Hot stones were placed in alcoves during early hours, while cold water basins marked the afternoon. Eventually, monasteries' very stones became a map of the day. If a monk woke confused, all he had to do was step into the hallway, inhale, touch the wall, and he would know. It is none. It is the 9th hour. It's time to sing. Outsiders found this bizarre. Traveling clergy who stayed the night spoke of dreams in which the walls hummed. Merchants described the place as a cloistered drum. Some accused it of mysticism, others of madness, but nothing changed, because the system worked. For nearly 200 years, Sanctum Horologium functioned like a body. Its monks lived and died by a rhythm so internalized that some were said to stop breathing the moment they missed their hour of chant. The monastery's calendar, maintained on a slowly dyed linen scroll, became one of the most accurate time records in medieval Italy, until 1511. That was the year a real clock arrived, donated by a well-meaning bishop from Bologna. The gift was meant to modernize the monastery. It was a fine Pisan iron-framed tower clock with a simple bell and a wooden face, crafted by a northern artisan who had worked on church clocks in Siena. The bishop believed the monks would welcome it, but when the crate arrived, they refused to open it. "We already have the hour," Brother Petrus reportedly said. "We do not need it," struck K. Not just from the bishop, but from Rome itself. K. Pell, visitor, found their echo-based system impressive but obsolete. He noted that the world was changing. That order now came from cities, from science, not from breath, and so, under pressure. The crate was opened, the clock was installed in the courtyard, and the singing began to fade. What followed wasn't dramatic. There was no protest, no revolt, just a slow erosion. The youngest monks began to rely on the bell, ignoring the texture underfoot, the scent of the oils, the cold of the walls. The corridors echoed less often. Some began to sleep past lauds, waiting for the clang of iron rather than the murmur of chant. By 1520, the relay system had collapsed entirely. The monastery still prayed, but the rhythm was mechanical now. They no longer lived the hour, they heard it, and that, to Brother Martialis' spiritual descendants, was a death of a kind. But something strange happened in the centuries that followed. In 1932, an ethnomusicologist from Germany named Clara Weiss was given access to the monastery's archives. She had come to study Gregorian chant variations. Instead, she found a fragmentary manuscript from the 15th century describing the breath clock, complete with architectural notes and a map of acoustic routes. She published her findings in 1930, and ironically, the same year Vatican archives would undergo another controversial clearing, and her paper was quickly forgotten in the flood of war. But in the decades that followed, her work was quietly rediscovered, first by architects curious about acoustic design, then by neurologists studying circadian rhythm, and eventually by digital interface designers, fascinated by the idea that space itself could convey time not through screens, but through texture, scent, temperature, and sound. In 1997, a team of engineers recreated part of Sanctum Horologium's hallway system in a German research lab using sensors and synthetic oils. It wasn't a clock in the modern sense. It had no output, but it could guide a person through a 24-hour cycle without any numbers. And remarkably, participants reported feeling less stress, greater spatial memory, and stronger connection to their bodily cycles than with any modern scheduling. It wasn't efficient, but it was human, and that was the lesson. What the monks built wasn't meant to be efficient. It was meant to make time sacred, tangible, not a thing on the wall, but a path beneath the feet. A hum in the chest, a cooling of the hands at sunset. They didn't need to know what time it was. They became the time, and maybe, in a world of relentless alerts and notifications, that's worth remembering. By the early 1600s, Sanctum Horologium had faded into the background of monastic life in Italy. Its once revolutionary system, built from breath, voice, echo, and discipline, was no longer spoken of. The clock in the courtyard had become just another ticking thing, its chime echoing through the foggy mornings and warm afternoons with mechanical certainty. The monastery was quieter, tidier, but perhaps, as one visitor noted in 1624, less alive. The Vatican had moved on. Europe had moved on. Clocks were no longer luxuries, but necessities. Cities grew noisy with the toll of bells. Public squares hosted ornate astronomical clocks that not only marked time, but mapped the heavens, charted the zodiac, and announced the hour with dancing figurines and rotating planets. Time had become something to be mastered, not followed. Sanctum Horologium, once unique, now felt antiquated. But while its innovations were no longer practiced, they were not entirely lost. Some monks, particularly those who had trained under older teachers, refused to fully abandon the old ways. They remembered, faintly, how to read the stone floors with bare feet, how to recognize the subtle shifts in incense and light, how to begin a chant, not because a bell told them to, but because their body whispered it was time. They began keeping secret journals, not out of rebellion, but of reverence. In these worn pages, we find evidence of something remarkable: the attempt to preserve a system of time that had no gears, no springs, no escapements. One monk, Brother Augustinus, wrote in 1673, "The bell rings for none, but I feel it was early. The hallway stones were not yet warm. The oil scent lingered too long from sext. Time is not wrong, but we have begun to measure without knowing." His comments, seemingly simple, hint at a much deeper tension. The monks of Sanctum Horologium were beginning to feel what modern workers and thinkers feel even today: the estrangement that comes when time is dictated by something external, not internal. They felt disconnected from the rhythm of their own lives, and so, quietly, they continued the old practices. Some even repaired and maintained the architectural systems, the acoustic tunnels, the scented alcoves, under the guise of cleaning or preserving tradition. They understood that the Vatican and the broader church had little interest in these subtleties anymore, but they remembered, and they waited. The Enlightenment only widened the gap. By the 18th century, time was rational, scientific, universal. John Harrison was building marine chronometers to measure longitude across oceans. Galileo's ideas about pendulums were transforming clock accuracy. In Paris, a scientist could now keep time with more precision than any monk ever dreamed of. In this new world, Sanctum Horologium became almost invisible. Tourists visited more ornate monasteries. Scholars sought bigger libraries. The monks, fewer now and older, carried on in quiet obscurity. The mechanical bell still rang. Meals were still served at precise hours, but beneath the visible order, something stranger lingered. A residual memory of time lived through sensation. Even the architecture seemed reluctant to forget. Visitors described strange acoustic quirks. One stood in certain corners of the chapel and sang softly. A second voice would echo from nowhere. The stone absorbed more warmth in some corridors than others. Certain oils, when burned in the prayer chambers, created a sense of weightlessness, or drowsiness, or gentle alertness, depending on the hour. These effects were never explained, never announced. They simply were. And then came 1939. It was a year of many changes, some violent, some quiet, all irreversible. As war loomed across Europe, the Vatican began to quietly consolidate and remove items from sites it considered historically significant. Some were moved for preservation, others were moved for secrecy. And one of those removals happened at Sanctum, Horologium. The clock, the iron and wood mechanism that had sat in the courtyard for over 400 years was quietly dismantled and carted away. No official reason was given. No record of its removal survives in Vatican archives. The local monks were not consulted. When they inquired, they were told simply, "It is no longer needed." It was gone. What replaced it was nothing. There was no new clock, no chimes, no visible timepiece. For the first time since the early 1500s, the monastery was without a mechanical marker of time. And the monks, many of whom had spent decades listening to the bell, found themselves adrift. But not all of them. A few, perhaps no more than 3 or 4, saw the removal not as loss, but as opportunity. They gathered in secret, not with rebellion in their hearts, but with curiosity, tested the old corridors, tested the temperature shifts, reburned the old incense recipes, chanted softly to find the echo paths. They tried to remember, and, remarkably, it worked. Within weeks, they began to experience something peculiar, a return to the old rhythm. Not perfectly, not fully, but enough to feel it the pulse of the monastery's ancient breath. Anecdotal notes from this period mention dreams timed with the hour of prime, spontaneous awakenings minutes before lauds, a renewed feeling of calm and rightness during prayer. And then, just as quietly as it began, it stopped. By 1943, the war had spread into Italy. Monasteries were evacuated. Some were looted, others burned. Sanctum Horologium, while spared the worst, lost several of its oldest monks. The quiet experiment ended. When the war concluded, the monastery became a retreat center. Later, a historical curiosity. Today, it is a rarely visited heritage site under local protection, mostly known for its frescoes and gardens. But if you ask the right person, usually a retired monk or an archivist with a taste, for footnotes, they might tell you something else. They might tell you about the hallway where sound still travels strangely, about the oil burner in the south chamber that still releases a scent of lemon balm and frankincense at midday, though no one refills it, about the stone tile that feels warmer than those around it, even in winter, and about the time, long ago, when the monastery itself kept time not by ticking, but by breathing. You see, in the end, the machine removed from the Vatican in 1939 wasn't the old clock. It was the monastery itself, not literally. Of course, the stones remain, but the idea of Sanctum Horologium as a human clock, it's a space built not to display time, but to embody it, that was the real machine. And when the Vatican removed the mechanical clock caps, they unknowingly gave the monks permission to return to something older, quieter, stranger, something that made no sound but measured everything. If you visit the Sanctum Horologium monastery today, you might think it's just another aging stone structure clinging to the slope of a quiet Italian hillside. The entrance is modest. The bell tower, while tall, no longer rings. Ivy softens the outlines of its once precise brickwork, and the fountain in the courtyard drips irregularly into a stone basin darkened by centuries of lichen. There is no guided tours, no souvenir shop. The air smells of damp stone, time, and old beeswax. But what you don't see is what lies beneath the courtyard, a few feet below the center of the stone-paved square. Hidden under layers of packed soil, gravel, and one replaced tile rests the last forgotten component of a timekeeping system unlike any other, a carved limestone chamber, no larger than a modest cellar. It has no doors, no ladder. A is not mentioned in the Vatican registry of monastic holdings, and yet it exists. For centuries, this chamber functioned as the heart knot, the brain. But the heart knot, Sanctum Horologium's most ancient, pre-mechanical rhythm, it was not built to measure seconds, nor to count minutes. It had no escapement, no dial, no face. What it did have was warmth, breath, and stone. Let me explain. The monks who designed this space, who likely lived in the 13th or early 14th century, understood something now lost in our obsession with mechanical precision, that human bodies are the most sensitive instruments of all. We notice things, adapt. We intuit rhythms before we quantify them. Inside this subterranean room, thin ducts carved into the limestone walls connected to various sections of the monastery above. These ducts were not for drainage or air. They served a subtler function. As incense burned in prayer rooms, its scent would gently drift down into the chamber and linger for varying lengths of time depending on the density of the air, the position of the sun, the change in wind direction. Even the type of oil used, balsam, myrrh, or pine, left different lingering traces, which the monks recorded, not with tools, but with time-trained senses. The temperature shifts from heated tiles, with barefoot footsteps, and sun-warmed stones overhead, would slowly radiate into the chamber, warming different segments of the wall at predictable intervals depending on the season. It was, in effect, a human-powered weather clock. And more astonishingly, the monks didn't just study it, they listened to it. Historical records from a surviving codex, now housed in a German university library, describe monks lying silently above the hidden chamber floor. their ears pressed to the stones, waiting to hear minute shifts in air pressure traveling up through the ducts. This was not madness or mysticism. It was a practical tool used to prepare for rituals, manage garden cycles, and wake without the use of bells. One particularly poetic passage reads, "When the wall speaks warm, prime is near. When the scent of resin lingers without sound, sext is past. And when no trace remains, the day has ended, though the sun still glows." This may sound imprecise to a modern mind, but for the monks of Sanctum Horologium, it was enough. Time was not something to conquer. It was something to align with. Now, let's return to the moment of disappearance. In 1939, when the Vatican removed the iron bell clock from the monastery courtyard, what they likely didn't know was that it had been placed directly above the hidden chamber. The vibration of its chime, the weight of its pendulum and gears, all of it had, for centuries, interfered with the delicate ecosystem of sound and temperature below. In removing the clock, unknowingly allowed the forgotten chamber to breathe again. It would take years for the monastery walls to resettle into their old rhythms, for the duct to clear, for the heat to once again distribute in ancient patterns. But they did, and in the silence that followed, a strange thing happened. Visitors few as they were began to report a curious experience upon entering the courtyard. Especially at dawn or dusk, they often felt a sensation of rightness, gentle inner alignment, as if their body knew exactly what hour it was without checking their wristwatch. Some described it as subtle warmth on the cheek, others a faint tingle in their souls. One visitor in 1957 claimed she smelled time and dust an hour before Vespers and knew it was time to rest. Of course, none of this is scientifically verifiable. No historian has yet proved the chamber exists. No archaeologist has been granted permission to excavate. The Vatican has no known record of its construction or purpose. But perhaps that's the point. Some machines don't need to be seen to be real. In recent decades, there's been renewed interest in alternative timekeeping. Some architects have studied ancient methods of shadow, sound, and scent to reintroduce circadian architecture into buildings. Certain universities in Japan and the Netherlands have constructed experimental rooms that mimic the monk-designed chamber at Sanctum Horologium spaces that use passive light, heat, flow, and fragrance diffusion to help people feel time instead of measure it. But none of them quite replicate the original, because what Sanctum Horologium had was not just architecture. It was memory. The stones themselves remembered the rhythms. The ducts, cleaned for centuries by candle smoke and prayerful breath, had settled into their shapes, not by design, but by habit. You can't blueprint that. You can't recreate something. That took hundreds of years of monks walking the same floors at the same time, whispering the same chants, burning the same oils. You can only protect it or forget it. Today, the last monks who understood even a fraction of the old system are gone. Their journals, passed through hands and languages, have mostly vanished or been miscatalogued in university basements. The Vatican does not mention the 1939 removal of the clock in any official history, and the chamber beneath the courtyard remains sealed not out of secrecy, but out of neglect. And yet, if you stand in that courtyard just before dawn, if you breathe in slowly and close your eyes, you may feel the faint echo of something waiting. Not a voice, not a sound, a timing, a breath, a machine without wires, gears, or code. The last timekeeping device built from stone, scent, and soul. And so we end this final story not with an answer, but with a question. If the most accurate time is the kind you feel, then what else have we forgotten to listen for? What other machines, silent, hidden, human, might still be ticking in places we've stopped noticing? And how much longer would they wait for someone to remember?